2 days ago, we got a message in our Facebook group asking, so in light of all this need for peace, what brought violence into the world? Today, we're going to answer that question. In yesterday's video, I had an interview with Chris Cruzado, and she told a story about her interaction with two 9-year-old boys who couldn't wait to turn 10 so they could start training in the military to kill the man who killed their father. At that moment, Chris realized, unless someone's willing to stop the violence at themselves, the cycle of violence just continues. If you missed that video, click here, you can go right to it. Now, to get back to our question, what happened that brought violence into this world? I posed this to Peace Church last night when a bunch of people from Peace Church were over here, and I got a few different answers. The first answer was something Mother Teresa said. There's no peace in this world because we forget we belong to one another. I think that illustrates a very true biblical point. Another person said, humanity was diverting from the original design of God's creation, and instead they chose to follow their own will. Humanity rejecting the way God called things to be, the way He created things to be, that we would be reconciled with Him, reconciled and have good relationships with one another, that we would have good understanding of who we are relative to Him and to creation, and that we would have a good relationship with creation. If we divert from that, that's the biblical definition of sin. Sin literally means, in Hebrew, missing the mark, as if there's a target here. And anytime you don't hit the target, how God designed things to be, that's sin. So, in the creation account in Genesis, we have God creating humanity and creation, and we're all relating with each other. But what happened in Genesis chapter 3 is you have the illustration of how all of these relationships fell apart. Genesis 3:8. The man and his wife heard the sound of God coming into the garden. And before, man and God and Eve had a great relationship. But they had eaten the fruit. And what happened after they had eaten the fruit and they were tempted by the serpent? They were hiding. And the God called out to the man, "Where are you?" And the man replied, "I heard you moving in the orchard, and I was afraid because I was naked." "Who told you were naked? Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" And the man immediately blames the woman. "The woman you gave me gave some of the fruit, and I ate it." But Adam was there. He had his own choice to make. So God said to the woman, what is it you've done?" And the woman replied, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate it." Again, she didn't take responsibility for her own choice, but she blamed the serpent for being tempted. It goes on and goes on to say, up to verse 18, where it says, childbirth would be hard, the relationship between men and women would be fractured, and that the ground was going to be hard to farm. So when sin enters the world, when things go outside of how God intends them to be, because humans choose to reject God's way and reject our need for God and relating to Him directly. So violence enters the world when humanity rejects God and comes outside of God's intended plan, which is sin. That's why shalom, biblical peace, is the antithesis of sin. It's things being as God intends them to be. And that's why it's such a central part of the biblical narrative. The other dynamic is that when humanity rejects God, they give some kind of authority and power to the accuser, to Satan. And he ends up in the Luke narrative, in the gospel narratives, he ends up being the one to tempt Jesus, to take power, to worship Him, to show the people that He's the Messiah. And there's this tension in the Gospels, and there's a conflict, a spiritual conflict between the devil and Jesus. And Jesus overcomes this spiritual authority that Satan has here on earth, the devil has here on earth, by dying on the cross. And the devil thinks he's won. He's killed God's Messiah. But in the resurrection, in the transformation of everything, when God raises Jesus from the dead, new creation begins, and God shows the world that He is making all things new. Just like we talked about in episode 3 and episode 2 about God has created new things in us being reconciled with Him. God has created a new humanity in tearing down the dividing wall between people. But praise God, in Jesus, that has been restored, and there is a new creation coming now. And we as the church are living in the new creation and inviting all other people, be reconciled to God, be reconciled to one another. That's the good news.